What I'm about to say is not meant to be taken as all-encompassing or as authoritatively absolute, because my experience is ultimately going to differ from many other mixed race people. So I am not speaking on behalf of other people. I am only sharing my anecdotal experience. With that said, I will define my terms by using the term mixed race because I fully acknowledge that the majority of people on the planet is mixed with something. Right? Most people on the planet are mixed with something to some percentage or another. I define mixed race in this context as anyone with a lineage of combined continental haplogroups within 1 to 3 generations. That is how I define mixed race. With that said, the hardest part of being mixed race for me depends on what stage of my life we are referring to. When I was much younger, the hardest part was preventing neuroticism that stunted my ability to live a full and rich life. I was too scared of what people thought of me, when in actuality, the world isn't thinking about me at all. This then begs the question about my own ego, because to say that the hardest part when I was younger was my neuroticism is simultaneously to say that the hardest part was actually the mitigation of my own ego, right? The inner battle. Because neuroticism generally dissipates the moment you stabilize and mitigate the ego, or the narcissism that is lacking self-awareness, right? That universally applies to us all, to one extent or another, on the gradient of narcissism. Once I achieved significant progress in mitigating my own ego with self-reflection, I became better empowered to empathically connect with the viewpoints of other people, to better analyze what they were actually thinking about, which then shifts my answer to the question. At that point, the hardest part of being mixed race then becomes more external than internal, dealing with the insecurities of other people. Right? The battle shifts from within to without. Right? Not my insecurities, but their insecurities. And who's they in this context? Right? Once you begin to see how every type of person with a strong racial or cultural ego, regardless of their skin color, regardless of what racial group that we're talking about, different than the people who lack a strong racial or cultural ego, because this topic is not important to everyone. That those people, those specific psychographic segmentations of people have an agenda. Right? And the foundation of that agenda, with the foundation of that agenda comes fear. There's always fear, because the ego is like attachment incarnate. And attachment is the source of suffering, fear, jealousy, etc. So once you master the bulk of your own insecurities, you begin to become scarily adroit at seeing the insecurities in those that you thought had none at all. The proudest Europeans, for example, tend to fear or resent the existence of people like me. In varying contexts, they fear being outdone by people like me. They fear being conquered by people like me. And this is historically verifiable by a variety of texts that were published during Lincoln's time that basically warned against the Emancipation Proclamation, because they were afraid, openly afraid. There are many texts that you can find online, historical texts. They were afraid of the mixed race man of the future, what they classified as the hybrid that would ultimately succumb to inner bitterness and not retain any kind of love for Europe or Europeans, while using their own genetic advantages against them to conquer them. Right? This was the idea at the time, the fear at the time. Right? So this heavily influenced the cultural evolutionary psychology of proud Europeans moving forward, even to this day. And I still experience some element of that insecurity every once in a while. Now, the more that I speak, the more that I reveal how people like me think in a way that is way more credible than some SJW pontificator like Ibram X. Kendi, whenever they tend to speak about people like me. The more I speak, the less I see that insecurity, because the more I speak, the more many proud Europeans see that I really do love them. That no, it's not always the case that people like me will succumb to our bitterness and want to destroy Europe. As a matter of fact, it can happen quite the opposite. Quite the opposite can occur, and does more often than they think, as people like me have to also deal with the insecurities of psychographic groups like pro-black supremacists, right? Which since, let me shift. In fact, it's usually worse with pro-black people because they tend to be more insecure than anyone, right? And for understandable reasons, as blacks are the least respected people in the world in general. Pro-black people tend to not only be the most insecure, but also the most shunning, judgmental, violent, and predatory. And predatory is a key word here. By predatory, I mean to express one of the biggest contradictions you will see pro-black people behave with when talking about or interacting with mixed race people. Right? For as much as they are known for ranting and raving about their stance against their concept of white supremacy, they will simultaneously be the number one people guilty of applying bygone Jim Crowian one-drop rule politics or evolutionary psychology to an interracial child's identity, not for the mixed race child's benefit, but their own insecurity. Pro-black people would much rather socially terrorize, in general, they would much rather socially terrorize and psychologically abuse a mentally vulnerable young mixed race person into renouncing their non-black ancestry, thereby inducing a neurotic complex within the child without care. And then use that child with their hybrid vigor, like a chess piece, to achieve political goals that they could not achieve on their own otherwise, than what they knew to be deep down the better path for that mixed race child's mental health. Right, to them, to the pro-blacks, the time of Jim Crow was terrible and should never see any form of fruition ever again, unless they can cherry pick the one-drop rule as it suits them to brainwash a child into hating themselves and their own European ancestry, or whatever the non-black ancestry may be. Right. So the hardest part is standing up for myself at this point. Right. And the more you do it, the better you get it, the more effortless it becomes. Where it's just not even hard anymore. But if I had to answer the question, if I had to come up with some sort of an answer, the hardest part at this point would be standing up for myself and other people like me, not allowing pro-black speakers to speak as if they are the authorities of my experience in psychology in the public, nor backing down when they threaten violence, either directly or indirectly for their own political goals. Right. White nationalists will typically lash out in a comment every once in a while, but I have yet to see anything go further than that. Even if we meet in person, typically they'll keep their thoughts inside. Black nationalists, on the other hand, they are a totally different, they are on a whole other level, and experience has taught me that it is just wise for people like me to avoid them and their communities while not letting their shame or guilt tactics to get to me for deservingly leaving them behind throughout the process of either my self-actualization or my family's. So in summation, the hardest part about being interracial, for me, in my experience, was at one point dealing with my own insecurities until I metaphysically matured into a man, at which point the hardest part became about dealing with the insecurities of others and the varieties of ways that they may manifest. So if you are mixed race and still going through the first phase or racial or cultural neuroticism, know that there really is a light at the end of the tunnel. Do not allow yourself to get trapped there, stunting your own self-actualization, right? Tapping into your truest potential for your whole life simply because you are afraid to be judged or rejected by someone.